Okay, class, this is the last of the videos for the fundamentals of poetry. You will notice that the last part of the handout is pretty much everything. I mean, it's pretty much stuff you already know on the figures of speech. And this is the idea of that imagery, that painting that picture, that getting you to see deeper into it. And imagery is one of the main things, as you learned in class today, about how the poetry builds. So I'm not going to go through every single word on this list. I'm going to highlight the ones that you might need help with. So I'm going to skip the first three, simile, metaphor, and personification, which are used a lot in poetry. So making sure that you know those and paying attention to those, it actually gives you a couple samples here. And we saw metaphor when we were looking at snapping beans in class yesterday. Now, synecdoche and metonymy. Synecdoche is the technique of mentioning a part of something to represent the whole. I've talked about the idea of all hands on deck or give you a hand. That idea that that part represents the actual whole body. And then metonymy is another form or another aspect of synecdoche in the idea that it's the substitution of a word naming an object for another word closely associated. So pay tribute to the crown. It doesn't mean pay tribute to an actual crown. What it means is paying tribute to the king or the queen or the monarchy, the person wearing the crown. Okay. And then the White House has decided. It's not the White House that decided. The House itself cannot make a decision. It's actually the president that decided. Okay. Symbol is spelled wrong. I don't know why it's spelled wrong. And up here, my numbers are off. There are only 16 of these. But symbol should be spelled correctly, so fix that on yours. You know what symbol is. Allegory, we're going to see those within poetry itself. It's a narrative or description having a second meaning beneath the surface. So that idea that it has both literal and figurative meaning. So if something has a bridge in it, a bridge usually, I mean, a bridge is a bridge. You cross a river with it, you cross a lake with it, type things. But on the other side, or the symbolic or figurative side of a bridge, you see the idea of a new beginning, a new life, starting something new, starting something fresh. So when we're looking at poetry and when we're looking at allegorical poetry, everything in there has a literal and a symbolic meaning. The next two we have here, overstatement and understatement. Overstatement is that exaggeration. Another word for it is hyperbole, which you probably use more often, and hyperbole is the more acceptable way to look at this. And making sure that you get that correct is important, especially for the AP test. And then we have understatement, is when you're lessening the meaning or you're giving it less force. So when you say something like there were many casualties, instead of saying a million people died, we just said there were many casualties. So we're lessening it, we're understating it, and we're making it not seem as bad. Okay. Antithesis, you know, it's that balancing, that contrast of one term against another. Remembering that antithesis, though, is in parallel form. Okay, it has the parallel grammatical structure, whereas paradox does not. So the example I gave here is man proposes, God disposes. So that idea of that opposites within there of starting something and ending something with the propose and the dispose. And then man and God also is the antithesis itself. Apostrophe is one we've kind of talked about before. It's this idea of addressing someone or something that is usually not present as though they are present. So it's like you're talking to the person, but they're not there to actually talk to. Poets do this a lot in poetry, especially like the first line of a poem. The one I give here, this example, Captain, my captain, a fearful trip is done. So the captain, my captain, they're talking to a captain, but a captain's not there. We'll see in some poetry things like the author goes, "Oh moon," or "Oh sun," or "Oh sleep." When they say things like that at the beginning, they're talking to that inanimate object that doesn't necessarily talk back to them. The next three are all forms of irony, the dramatic and the verbal, and situational. Reviewing those is important because they're going to show up again. Paradox is that contradiction again, like antithesis, but these are not in grammatical structure. Okay, so they're not, yes, they are placed by each other, but they don't fit a grammatical structure. They look more like an oxymoron would in that sense. So oxymoron is the last one. It's a compact paradox, as in like really close to each other, two contradictory terms. They're placed side by side. They can be within a sentence, but they're usually right next to each other. Three examples I give here: bitter, sweet. Something that's bitter, like chocolate, still has that sweet side to it, so it's bittersweet chocolate. If you're a wise fool, you're you're a wise and smart person, but on the other side, you might be a fool in other things. You might be book smart, but you might be foolish in like street stuff. Living death. So you could look like living death, as in like you're alive, but you look like you're really, really sick. Um, so those are the main 16 things that we're going to look at when we look at poetry. Next, I want to look at stanza forms. Now, stanza forms is a division of poem based on thought or form. Stanza is the equivalent of a paragraph in prose. Okay, so an author, it has a complete thought. It ends with a end punctuation mark, and based on how many lines the stanza is, would be what type of a stanza we would call it. Okay, what I put here are the 6 more common stanza lengths that we're going to look at. We will see others, but we don't necessarily name others. These are just the ones that are more common. So a couplet is 2 lines of rhymed poetry. So if we look at Canterbury Tales, every 2 lines rhyme, so we called it rhyming couplets. Okay, triplet is a 3-line stanza. We will also see terza rima, which is another word for triplet. It's another form of a 3-line stanza, terza rima. It's Latin, or it's actually, I think it's Italian. Quatrain is a 4-line stanza. Sestet is a 6-line stanza. Septet is a 7-line stanza, and octave is an 8-line stanza. Now, the more popular ones we will see will be the even numbers, the couplet, the quatrain, the sestet, and the octave, especially when we get into formulaic poetry and what it's built like and how it looks, specifically having to do with sonnets and villanelles and stuff like that. So there are different types of poetry. This is it for your video for today. This is it for your fundamentals of poetry. I highly suggest, and in fact, I'm just going to say do this. I want note cards, and you'll be turning in your note cards on next week on Thursday when you take your fundamentals of poetry test. You can do stanza on one note card and list the 6. Then you have the 16, so that gets you 17 note cards so far. And then each of these here should have their own note card. Okay, so each of the first, that's 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. Do all of these as 32. Okay, so the verse forms are all one. So this should be 32 note cards. In devices of sound, I want each of the rhymes on a separate one. So one should be the perfect, one should be the near off, one should be the I. On positions of rhyme, there are 2, the end and the internal. And kinds of rhyme, there are the 3. So these each need to have their own note cards. And go look up words. Write words on your note cards as samples. Don't use necessarily the samples that I give you, because then you're seeing only those samples. Go look up samples of them as well. Okay, have a good night and see you later.